Open your Bibles with me, if you would, for tonight, to start with, Romans chapter 8. We've been dealing with the last several weeks and looking at the roles of a man, biblical roles of a man, biblical roles of a woman in this bond of matrimony. We've, in the course of our series, have gotten to the place where the courting is over and the I do's have been said, and this young couple in our current study, they're working through learning their role. Last week we discussed a little bit as to why that's so important. Why is it so important that we live within our roles? That we, in the language of today, that we stay in our lane. And the answer to that, why it's so important, is because it is the institution, marriage is the institution that God designed and blessed humanity with. So He designed it. And the first reason to stay within your role, He designed it. And He knows what works. He designed it to be that way. And the husband's got a few primary roles. He's primary provider. He's maybe not sole, but he's at least a primary provider all things being equal. He's protector. He's to love and cherish her. She has some supportive roles. Remember, the roles are different, but they're not different because of superiority and inferiority. They're different because of God's design. And her roles are different. Her primary roles are supportive roles, helpful roles, submitting roles. And it's important because He designed it that way, and when something is designed a certain way, it works the best that way. And it's also important, we dealt with last week for most of the message, about the fact that it is important because it's a picture of Christ and His church. And so we mar the image. We devalue the picture just a little bit if we don't operate in our God-given roles. I said that to say this. I wanted to start with Romans chapter 8 and verse 29. And the soteriological aspect of this and the salvation aspect of this is not where I'm headed. But it's here. It's the context of it. For whom He did foreknow, He also did predestinate, to be conformed to the image of His Son. I want that to resonate in your hearts. That it is the goal of salvation that one finds himself in the process of being conformed to the image of His Son. That which Jesus approves of, we would then approve of. That which He opposes, we would then oppose. That which He is has found to be, taught to be a good example and a good direction, we will try to strive to be that good example and go in that direction. That which He warns about and says, don't go in that direction. And even as you think about this, being conformed to the image of Christ. We'll get to Ephesians 5 later in the message, Lord willing. But husbands are told to love their wives even as Christ loved the church, and that is unconditional, agape kind of love. A love no matter what. A love in spite of anything. Love. And to be conformed to the image of Christ is to bear that kind of love. we also see Christ humbling himself and submitting himself to the will of the Father. So there is the aspect that he models for us in that, what it looks like to be equal with God and still submit to the Father, as the role of the wife, being in the sight of God equal, but her role is more of a supportive role, a helping role, and we'll see in Ephesians 5, one who submits. So we can be conformed to the image of Christ, and the only way that we can is to be operating in our proper God-given role, function. And that's important because it's his design, that's how it works best. And it's picturing him. And God is very concerned about his imagery, his pictures, his typology. Don't mess with God's typology. So in this series, that's where we've gotten to. Married, learning and growing in our God-given roles. Tonight we pick up with striving to create an environment where we are helping each other. Verse 29 again, being conformed to the image of his Son. In the institution of marriage is a place where that is so beneficial. It's beneficial in any relationship. It's beneficial in your relationship with your neighbor. But not like it is in a marriage where you and another person are glued together for life, now under the same roof, not 24/7, obviously, because you have various things that you do through the day, but for all practical purposes, stuck together, and I don't mean that in a bad way. And I don't ever want it to sound like I do, but stuck together and loving it. Remember, that was one of the goals. And that's the goal of this series, is not just to endure marriage for 50, 60 years and say, wow, we made it. Whew. But to honor God, having his image, being conformed to his image, the image of his Son. Honoring God as a godly husband, or honoring God as a godly wife, or honoring God in our coming together in this institution of marriage. And there's no place probably that it's more important than to have this goal. And husbands and wives should commit to this goal. Honor, let's work together to help each other be conformed to the image of his Son. And anything that hinders that, anything that I do that mars that image, anything that I do that will cause my partner, my mate, to be hindered in that goal should be avoided, done away with. All things done with the hope and goal in mind of honoring him. First obeying him, and by obeying him, honoring him. So then, a revisit, if you would, with me to Genesis 2. You got to go back to Genesis 2 and begin to, again, look at this account, the blessing of God, the amazing blessing that God gave to man, this institution of marriage. And when this is right, how wonderful it is. When this is right, how amazing this is. When this is functioning as God designed it. Just what an encouragement it is, what a blessing it is, what a stronghold it is. You're there to pick each other up. You're there to support each other. You're there to encourage one another. There's just so much here. And as by the blessing of the Lord, if children are allowed to be entered into the equation, and then that marriage unit is strong and both functioning within their God-given roles, the children see that, the children learn from that, and they're well-rounded. And you can tell it. You can tell it. And so, what a blessing it is. What an amazing blessing that God gave us with the institution of marriage. And the way to live together, and the way that we can raise children together and as a society grow. And godly parents raising godly children, causing the godly population, raising the children to be godly, whether or not that always is the case remains to be seen. But godly parents striving to raise godly children and having those to grow up, striving to be conformed to the image of His Son. Having those to grow up and try to mirror what they saw, the good of what they saw in the parents' union. And so we pick this up in Genesis 2:20 to 21. The Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept. And he took one of the ribs and closed up the flesh instead thereof. Verse 22, and the rib which the Lord had taken out of man made he a woman, and brought her unto the man. And Adam said, This is now bone of my bones, and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called... I lost my place. I was looking at another spot. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. We're going to deal tonight with the one flesh. But I've recently, again, and I brought this up last week, I believe it was how struck that I was about Adam, considering the fact that Eve was literally made from him. She was not another that God brought to Adam's side and said, Here, love her and care for her. She literally came from his bone and flesh. And I believe that had, and you can see it here in this is, in verse 23, this is now bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. She literally came from me. And the bond that they would have, the sense of responsibility that he would have, and I believe did have. And it's teachable to us that these things are to be in our thinking as the Lord unites even now a man and a woman in the bonds of matrimony. Obviously not in the sense of bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, but in the sense of verse 24, the leaving of father and mother. Notice that the husband and the wife in verse 24 are one flesh. We're going to develop that. But the husband to his parents, that's a relationship that will be forever altered. That's a relationship that will be to some regards severed. The man's no longer under their authority. The man's no longer under their supply chain. He's now the head of his home. He's now the primary provider. That relationship with his parents is to some degree severed, and rightly so. Now, It never means that you can dishonor your parents. It never means that you stop communicating with your parents. But they immediately take on a very different role, and thus also for the wife as she cleaves into her husband. But what it says of the husband and the wife, they shall be one flesh. He'll cleave unto his wife. They'll be glued together. They'll be stuck together in this wonderful relationship of one flesh. Not even the children of this union will be described as one flesh. That which carries some of the same DNA and some of the same molecular structure and some of those things that parents pass on to children, but yet that child is not called one flesh with that parent. That will be a relationship that in 18, 20, 25, 30 years will give way to a new relationship with a spouse, most likely. And so this one flesh is very remarkable. This one flesh is very noteworthy, and we want to develop that tonight. Matthew 19. This overlapped a little bit. It wasn't by design necessarily. I was making a different point this morning in Matthew 19 about the Lord's view of Scripture and His reliance on the books of the law, Moses' writing. But we left off reading at verse, I think, I don't remember where we left off this morning, but our emphasis this morning was on verse 4. The Lord's words, have you not read, that He which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. This idea of one flesh, the Lord quotes it. We read it in Genesis chapter 2 in your hearing, and these two are one flesh. Wherefore, verse 6, they are now no more twain. This husband and this wife, they're not to be considered, strictly speaking, they're not to be considered as two standalone entities that have entered into some kind of an agreement. They are considered now not twain, but one flesh. And the importance of that is what, therefore, God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. And of course he gets into and goes down, and they said right away, well Moses then, why did Moses then command the writing of divorcement, put her away? He said, it was verse 8, that's because of the hardness of your hearts. Moses suffered or allowed it. But from the beginning it was not so. So that wasn't the original design, and we're going to deal with that one flesh aspect. And the importance of that and the permanence of it is something that we need to stress in thinking about the seriousness of marriage. Why would one take this so serious? Why, and many today don't take it very serious, but why is it a serious thing? Why are brides nervous on that day? Why are grooms nervous on that, standing there in a cold panic sweat? This is for real. This is for keeps. This is permanent. We're about to be united in marriage. And the design of that is to picture Christ and His church. And so to fulfill that design properly, to fulfill that picture properly, we're going to remain together. We're going to be, in every sense, one flesh, and to be one flesh, not any longer considered two, but now considered one, and you can't divide one and make it two again. It's one flesh. You are now an inseparable unit. And if we enter into that and realize that, we endeavor to do everything that we can to work through it. And with any wisdom at all, and with any blessing of God at all, we say, I don't want to be miserable the next 30 years with you, so I'm going to endeavor to fulfill my role. Would you please endeavor to fulfill your role and try to get back to and stay with the God-given roles that we've emphasized over the last couple weeks. But you're now an inseparable unit. You have to work through the issues, and just for sanity's sake, you should want to. You should want to. I want to take a solid look at an honest look, and that's the hardest thing for an individual to do, to face our own failures and our faults and our shortcomings. But if we're serious, and if not for the overarching goal of honoring God, then also, I mean, that's the real reason it ought to be, but sometimes for just enjoyment of life, just to get along and be stuck with this person and love it. And you can be, when God is in it and when biblical roles are being put into place. And that will then picture Christ and His church. Ephesians 5. What if the Lord's relationship with His people was such that He easily just said, you know what, I've had enough of you, and cast one aside? Well, you know, you used to be something, and now not so much. And I've kind of fallen out of like with you. And so be gone. What if that was the kind of relationship the Lord demonstrated? You hear about these people that fall in love and out of love like most people change their socks. It's whatever, no big deal. It is a big deal if you're trying to honor God. It really is. Because Ephesians 5:32, verse 31 first. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and be joined unto his wife. And the idea of it is to be inseparably glued or stuck with his wife. And they two shall be one flesh. No longer separable. No longer an option. Till death do you part. But he follows that after Paul's quoting the same place the Lord's quoting in Matthew 19. He's quoting Genesis 2. And he's in good company because the Lord quoted Genesis 2. And they quote it so close, almost word for word, and says, what I've been talking to you about is a mystery, but I'm speaking concerning Christ and the church. Nevertheless, let every one of you in particular so love his wife even as himself, and the wife see that she reverence her husband. He goes into this relatively lengthy instruction form of the roles of the husband and the role of the wife. And says, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. But nevertheless, husbands, love your wives. And let's back up and let's tie this together, this one flesh, this inseparable union that these two have entered into, the two hypotheticals in our series here that are now happily married and striving to be conformed to the image of His Son. And the way to do that, operating in my lane as it relates to what God would have me to do. And so we go right back up, verse 28. So ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. Not necessarily so much like my own body, but as being my own body. We are now one. And I am to love my wife as my own body. Whatever affects her affects me. Whatever affects me affects her. We are one. An inseparable unit now that generally speaking, for all parts being equal, rise and achieve and grow together or not together. So ought men love their own wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. For no man ever yet hateth his own flesh, but nourisheth and cherisheth it, even as the Lord the church. We must grow in Christ to be conformed to the image more and more closely. And anything that hinders that oneness must be avoided. Anything, we're one flesh and we're inseparable, but whatever threatens that, whatever tugs at that, whatever hinders that from being a blessed and joyful and mutually satisfactory union must be avoided. Communication is something we'll hit more in the future, but communication, just to be able to talk through and communicate and to get serious about communicating real thoughts, real desires, real goals together. And make it a point that the deepest things that you share with your spouse, not your coworker. The deepest things that you share, the deepest concerns, the heaviest burdens, the greatest joys, the worst fears, those things that trouble you, or those things that make you ecstatic. That's a conversation to have with your spouse, not your coworker. Anything that strains on that one flesh, anything that causes the slightest amount of stress or drama is to be avoided. And to consider the other person in it at all times. How will my confiding in this person affect my relationship with my spouse, and so on, that kind of thing. Anything that hinders that oneness. What's the primary thing that hinders that oneness? Sin. A lot of other things hinder it as well, but many times it's just sin. sin of whatever that hurts my spouse and causes stress, causes a tension in that oneness, and makes it so that oneness is challenged a little bit, and makes it so that the joy meter goes down because the spouse is dealing with the reality of the spouse's sin. Or the spouse's sin may be being, or the sin of one of them may be being out of their lane. And we dealt with that last week, where we're to be mindful to stay in our lane, to operate within our God-given purview, role, and not to ask the other person in this union, not to ask them to operate outside their role. The wife is not to be asking the husband to submit to her. That's outside the rule. And so that would mar the image. The husband is not to be asking the wife, I want you to be the primary breadwinner. I want you to be the primary protector, and so on. There are these roles. And whatever hinders this oneness, especially in the realm of sin, it's to be avoided. Constantly asking ourselves, what would God have me to do to best love my wife? And that, like Peter reminds us to, I wonder if I can jump up there quickly. If I can lay my eyes on it right away. Yes. 1 Peter 3. Verse 7. Likewise, ye husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge. Now, in this context, Peter has been dealing with, again, verse 1, likewise, wives, be in subjection to your own husbands. And it may be that you can win them back by your lifestyle and mannerisms if they're off track and so on. And he addresses the men in verse 7, likewise ye husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge. Dwell with them according to knowledge. Peter's addressing it to husbands dwelling with their wives according to knowledge. Application can obviously be made that the wife should know her husband. And as you operate together under one roof, spend that much time together in close proximity to one another, you begin to learn one another. And you need to. And here the instruction is, dwell with them according to knowledge. Know them. Take the time. You took the time to win her attention. You took the time to woo her unto yourself enough to get her to say, yes, I will. And yes, I do. And you don't stop there. We shouldn't stop there. That we dwell with them according to knowledge. Learn what makes them tick and come alive. Learn what makes them secure, what makes them feel loved. Learn to dwell with them according to knowledge. Working on that one flesh. Not just being one because we must, but one because the husband has devoted his love to this woman. And she says, I'm okay with that. No matter what, I know he loves me. and she reciprocates with submitting and helping and doing everything she can do to lift up his hands. And he says, I'm okay with that. I got a helpmeet that loves me and does her level best to support me and help me. And they're operating in their roles, and they're just still all... Some of the early sparks of the honeymoon may be over with, but there's still an abiding agape passion for this person. And he then naturally desires to know what she needs, how she feels, what she thinks. Dwell with her according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel. And we're working towards really being one flesh. We are, but being one flesh and loving it. Being one flesh and both of us having striving to be conformed to the image of Christ. And we can't, you really stop to think about it, this is the only kind of a union. And with this union with both mother and father, husband and wife, both functioning in their God-given roles, this is then by far the best environment to raise a child, because the child or the children learn what a godly dad looks like. The children learn what a godly leader looks like. The children learn what it is to be head of the home. The young men learn that, and the ladies see it and learn what they're to be looking for. And the ladies, the picture of what it is to be that helpmeet and lovingly submitted to this man who is loving her unconditionally. And both genders of children can see that and say, that's what a godly father looks like. That's what a godly mom looks like. And I either want to be with that, or I either want to be that person, or I want to find that person, marry him, depending on which gender you are. And really, that's the very, very best that we can offer. And anything short of that complicates the upbringing of the child, complicates the raising of children, complicates their view of this institution called marriage. If they see the roles being reversed, or they see things out of place, or they don't see the husband loving the wife unconditionally, and they don't see all of those things, they don't learn them. They don't understand what it's supposed to be, and then that's a generational cycle that just tends to I was going to say complicate. That's compound was the word that I meant. It's just generational cycle that just compounds, and the flaws become more and more. And I think that our society is demonstrating that. We have more and more single parents raising children. We have more and more children that are coming up and they don't know what it is to see a godly head of the home modeled. They don't know what it is to see a godly mom modeled. And so then they have children, they have no idea themselves how to fulfill those roles or model those things for their children. And all of that then drives us farther and farther away from the image of Christ and the picture of Christ and His church. This is all very important. God in Ephesians 5 dedicated half a chapter to the way that marriage is a picture of Christ and his church. It's very important. It's very practical. These two shall be one flesh. And the practical aspect of that, let's do it right and enjoy it. Have a mutually satisfactory relationship where both are loving it. And say, sign me up for another 10 years. Sign me up for another 10 years. All the while building a home that honors Christ and raising children to honor Christ and keep that cycle going. Let's stand.